Excellent. So this session is now being recorded. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, as I said, looking at the laws and policies for strengthening climate resilience. My name is Dr. Doug Cuby from the School of Law in University College Cork, Ireland. Over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to hear from a range of expert academics and practitioners on the theme of law and policies which can strengthen climate resilience. The interconnected activities of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development are at the heart of this discussion. And we'll hear from both a global perspective, as well as 3 case studies examining Sweden, Kenya, and Ireland. Before we get started, there are a few brief housekeeping notes I'd like to note. First of all, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available at the end of the session. We'll also be producing a short written report of the webinar, which will be available in due course. The audience microphones are muted. I'd be grateful if you could just check that your microphone is muted. We will be having a question and answer session at the end, and I'd encourage you to use the chat box to type in questions. We won't be taking questions at the end of each presentation, but if you type in the questions, we will be collating these and we'll then be able to have a question and answer session at the end of all 4 presentations. We have a great lineup of presentations this morning. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in advance of their presentation. However, I'd first of all like to acknowledge the kind support of the EU Jean Monnet project, disseminating disaster law in Europe, for financial support in the running and hosting of this webinar. Our colleague, Professor Giulio Bartolini, is going to be saying a few words about this project at the end of the webinar. I'd also like to thank the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, in particular Isabel Granger. Isabel is the Global Coordinator of the Disaster Law Programme in the IFRC, based in Geneva. Isabel has played a key role in promoting and advancing our understanding and the implementation of disaster law, as well as bridging the gap between academic research and practitioner implementation, both in her current role and in her former role as head of the Disaster Law Programme for the Americas. Isabel has kindly agreed to say a few words of opening for this webinar, so I'd like to hand over to Isabel now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, esteemed panelists and colleagues. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today for the webinar on law and policy for strengthening climate resilience. The IFRC is extremely pleased to collaborate with the University College Cork and the University of Rometry in this event. In the last 2 decades, IFRC disaster law has developed guidance for law and policy makers on best practice for domestic disaster law and policy. Further, IFRC disaster law and National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, as auxiliary to their government in their humanitarian field, have provided technical legal advice to governments and support in its strengthening disaster risk governance through laws and policies. To date, we have conducted disaster law activities in more than 90 countries. Through this work, communities are safer and the most vulnerable are better protected when faced with crisis. However, the increasing frequency, severity, and unpredictability of extreme climatological events driven by global warming is leading to increased vulnerability for a wide range of states, communities, and individuals around the world. It is critical to build long-term resilience and well-functioning disaster risk management systems to reduce the impact of disasters. As such, there is a need to develop further guidance to strengthen legal frameworks to address rising climate and disaster-related risk, as well as align climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and sustainable development, and integrate the commitments of the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, and Sustainable Development Goals into domestic legal and policy frameworks. The need to ensure an integrated approach to disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change in domestic disaster laws, policies, strategies, and plans and the need to address the humanitarian consequences of climate change was reiterated by the state parties to the Geneva Convention and the component of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement at the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in 2019. In today's event, we will hear of best practices in governance mechanisms taken by states and non-state actors, which have enabled better alignment, coordination, and communication between all stakeholders, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerabilities of the most at risk. The initiative and evidence-based recommendation we will hear about today will support the international dialogue and provide sound advice to foster a more integrated approach in national legislation and institutions. IFRC is extremely pleased for their collaboration that has taken place in the last 2 years with the University College Course School of Law in the joint research project entitled Leave No One Behind, Developing Climate-Smart Disaster Risk Management Laws that Protect People in Vulnerable Situations for a comprehensive implementation of the UN Agenda 2030. And on behalf of the IFRC, I also wish to thank and acknowledge the support provided by the Irish Research Council, the EU Jean Monnet project, and the German government for their support to the project and to this event. Thank you very much, and over to you, Doug.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Isabel. And as Isabel mentioned, for the past couple of years, University College Cork and the Federation have been working jointly in a project examining how to integrate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And our first presenter is Dr. Tommaso Natoli. So Tommaso is an Irish Research Council, Mary Slabowska Curie Fellow in the School of Law in UCC. He was seconded to the IFRC Disaster Law Programme in Geneva, and for the past years has been researching this intersection between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and the Sustainable Development Goals in the Pacific and Caribbean regions, and he's currently finalising a global synthesis report on his findings. We're going to have each of the presentations will be 15 minutes, and I will be keeping strictly to time on this to ensure that we also have time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So Tommaso, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. And can you just confirm you can see my first slide and hear me?
Yes, I confirm we can. Yes, thanks.
Perfect. So thank you again, and thanks to all friends and colleagues that joined us today. I would like to start with an overall description of the background of my study. The main aim of my research was to investigate how to address the increased vulnerability for a wide range of states, communities, and individuals around the world against extreme climatological events that, as we all see, are more and more frequent, severe, and unpredictable. And the need for all of us to adapt to a changing climate is clear, and this goal is inherently linked with the two sectors of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. These two fields of action to be considered within the wider frame of sustainable development, as clearly stated in the UN Agenda 2030, are at the core of any effort to enhance climate resilience, which is the core concept of my research, and can be defined as the ability of a community to resist, absorb, adapt to, transform, and recover from climate-related hazards in a sustainable and efficient manner. This is because the two sectors have partially overlapping goals, namely the reduction of losses due to weather and climate-related hazards, including both slow onset and sudden events, and the reduction of vulnerabilities in at-risk communities all around the world. Now, I must say that in 2021, this is not a novelty anymore, as the urgency of greater coherence between CCA and DRR has been increasingly reflected in most relevant instruments, resolutions, and reports adopted at international level since 2015, and starting with the SDGs, the Sendai Framework, and the Paris Agreement, all of which connect one another in more or less explicitly. But this was also stated more recently, as Isabel mentioned, by the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement held in Geneva in December 2019. On that occasion, through the adoption of Resolution 7 on disaster laws and policies that leave no one behind, the state parties to the Geneva Conventions and the components of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement acknowledged the need to ensure an integrated approach to disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change in domestic laws, policies, strategies, and plans. But with this resolution, the conference also, this is maybe more relevant for my research in this case, also requested the IFRC to continue to support national societies and states in the field of disaster laws, including with respect to climate change adaptation, through technical assistance, capacity building, as you can read, development of tools, models, and guidelines, but also ongoing research and promotion of the sharing of experiences, techniques, and best practices among countries. And this is exactly the basis on which my project was conducted in the last 2 years. So I started from the consideration that in a broad sense, greater climate resilience can be obtained in domestic systems through the adoption of more integrated laws and policies aimed at reducing gaps and mismatches between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction objectives and related practices. To put it simply, this means to ensure complementarity between decisions undertaken as part of each agenda, namely reducing those actions that contribute to one set of goals but undermine the other, and on the contrary, favoring synergies across sectors. It is commonly recognized on this point that there is no one-size-fits-all model for this, quite the opposite, in the sense that new and more integrated governance should build on the analysis of existing capacities and mechanisms, and a certain level of flexibility should enable the targeting of different systems of risks, vulnerabilities, and ecosystems. And this was one of the challenges I had to face in the course of the last 2 years. More concretely, the introduction of reform of legislation by states is expected to contribute to enhanced coordination and communication between stakeholders, reducing the duplications, optimizing available resources, which in most cases are not sufficient, and improving effectiveness. The problem is that the previous literature did not provide guidance on specific normative standards to be followed along this path. And the IFRC disaster law has received many requests from National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to aid them in providing technical assistance to respective authorities to develop laws relating to climate resilience. So, bearing in mind the need to link research with concrete normative advancement and following practice, one of the main goals of my project consisted in the development and dissemination of recommendations for law and policymakers, building on and somehow complementing previous disaster law outputs produced by the IFRC in recent years, like the 2015 checklist on law and disaster risk reduction, or the 2019 checklist on law and disaster preparedness and response. So to this end, research in 4 countries was conducted, and this led to the identification of successful practice and main challenges in the adoption of governance mechanism that strengthen resilience capacities and reduce vulnerabilities of the most at risk. This provided the basis for a set of recommendations on how more integrated approach can be applied in different national and subnational contexts. And on this point, I think it's important to note that the rationale behind the project was not to make prescriptive normative claims about what degree or type of integration is preferable, or to identify a single ideal normative model, but rather to provide a tool for legal advocacy and technical assistance to domestic decision makers. So the 3 country reports I worked on were respectively on Fiji / Pacific Island countries, so there was also a regional approach in this research. The Philippines and Dominica, and the fourth report on Kenya was developed by colleagues in Nairobi, as will be described by Catherine in her presentation. These documents build on a combination of desk-based analysis and empirical research conducted in the countries through qualitative techniques, mainly interviews with key informants, and these key informants provided insights and evaluation of regional and regional and national normative processes, while also assessing the actual impact of relevant normative tools at different levels, and specifically the inclusion and consideration of vulnerable groups in decision-making processes. So thanks to this rich research material, a final global synthesis report, which will be published before the end of this month, contains 8 thematic sections, each of which addresses a specific issue necessary to improve the normative domestic system for enhancing climate resilience. And drawing on the 4 country case studies, each section provides evidence on how these issues are currently addressed by domestic law in sample countries, as well as examples of good practice. So I will now summarize just 2-3 of them very briefly, starting from the basic consideration that national authorities should make significant choices designed to have long-term impact on their governance model for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, including, for instance, through the adoption of more integrated laws, strategies, and plans, which, for instance, can expressly link and cross-reference one another, align with respective goals through the identification of common objectives and performance indicators, but also from an institutional point of view, stronger and more stable coordination between different ministries, agencies, and stakeholders, respectively engaged in these sectors, should also be ensured through a clear identification of respective mandates, but also the establishment of joint responsibilities and the adoption of cross-cutting administrative procedures and implementation planning. For instance, a national high-level political civil servant should be nominated as the focal point for climate resilience at the national level, and relevant ministries could also establish focal points representing the entry point for interministerial coordination. Secondly, relevant laws and policies in different sectors should develop common assessment mechanisms, like, for instance, establishing and favoring the application of combined monitoring system. They should align the timing for respective reviews and updates, and it's an interesting practice I studied in the Philippines, for instance. The identification of aligned sunset reviews for relevant instruments represent a useful counterbalance for discontinuous political leadership due to changes in governments and elected bodies. And this can also favor the joint consideration, so from the 2 sectors, of short and long-term changes in risk exposures and in socioeconomic features of involved communities that, of course, are constantly mutating. It is important in this sense to preserve the general support for such normative initiatives across all sectors of society, including in political parties and the upper levels of the civil service. And in this sense, the proactive role played over time by civil society involved in these fields, including National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, can be critical in this sense, simply because against the outlasting changes in political administrations, these organizations can contribute to constant advocacy efforts and the progressive creation of a technical and institutional awareness of these topics that survives governments, let's say. A third key point concerns how more integrated laws and policies relevant for climate resilience should make institutions responsible for budget allocation, for instance, ministries of finance or economic development, and should be directly part of CCA, DRR, mainstreaming efforts. And this is because many countries, as I said, have limited financial capacity to address disaster risks associated with climate change. And the few available resources should be optimized through a holistic approach to public expenditure. There are also multiple funding mechanisms that should be considered also by law and policies in order to improve access to different sources and opportunities. Monetary resources and technical resources can come and often come from international actors, multilateral and regional, or private donors. And so there is this need for flexible approach, also regulatory flexible approach. And this also includes the need to ensure a vertical distribution of resources across different levels of governance. Another element that is connected with the resource and the availability of resources is connected to the development of platform collecting open access data on hazards and climate information, and making these platforms and this information accessible across governmental bodies and sectoral institutions. This need was already highlighted by the IFRC checklist on law and disaster preparedness and response. In this case, a specific perspective on the need to favor the sharing of the support and the sharing of climate services is stressed in the recommendation included in the report. These are only the first 3 out of 8 recommendations I present and discuss in the final report, as mentioned. The other 5 that I want to address here for a matter of timing, respectively, concern to the need to favor normative alignment with instruments adopted in the national and regional levels, integrate CCA and DRR law and policies with development, and in particular sustainable development, with keeping always an eye on poverty reduction policies. But also, this is fundamental, a key component of my research, also keep addressing specific vulnerabilities, the protection of vulnerable groups, gender mainstreaming and social inclusivity, also through an effective and scaled down implementation through community engagement in all phases and stages of decision-making processes. And finally, of course, the relevance of building on the opportunities provided by nature and ecosystems is the core of the 8th recommendation. I think I will stop here now as I look forward to hearing about research findings on these topics from other colleagues with regard to specific countries. I just wanted to take the occasion of having both of them here to thank Doug QB and Isabelle Granger for their constant and invaluable support and guidance in all phases of this project during the last 2 years in their respective role of academic and secondment mentors. Thank you, Doug. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. And for the audience, you may have seen that I've posted a link in the chat where you can access all the published reports that Tommaso was mentioning, all his country reports, and then in the next, hopefully, few weeks, the Global Synthesis report as well. I also see there's a question come in for Tommaso, which is great. We're going to keep that till the end of the session, but do please post any questions you may have in the chat box. So as Tommaso mentioned, there's real complexity when we're thinking about how to integrate climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and then the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's no one size fits all, which is why for the next 3 presentations, we're going to start looking at country case studies. And first of all, we're going to take an example from Europe, from Sweden. So our colleague, Dr. Mari Aronsson-Storier, is a lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Reading. Marie is an expert in international law, both in the use of armed force as well as in disaster law. And she's written extensively on the UN Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. Earlier this year, Marie published an analysis of the implementation of the Sendai framework in Sweden at the request of the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. So thank you very much, Marie, for your presentation. We're very much looking forward to hearing how Sweden has managed to integrate the Sendai framework at the domestic level. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much. I'm just waiting for the screen. Can you see the screen now? Sorry, the first slide?
We can. Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So thank you so much to Doug, and thank you to all of the organizers and sponsors for inviting me to this interesting webinar. I'm really, really happy to be here today. So essentially, I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of a background of this project. So about a year ago now, in the summer of 2020, I was contacted by the Swedish focal point for the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, based at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, also known as MSB. And they commissioned me to conduct this gap analysis for the purpose of using the results to develop a national action plan for DRR in accordance with Target A of the Sendai framework. For those of you, if anyone in here are not very familiar with the Sendai framework, it is the current globally negotiated roadmap for disaster risk reduction. And in terms of actions, it's divided into 4 key priorities, each with specific measures to be taken on global as well as national and local levels. And the primary purpose of this study was to assess Sweden's ongoing and existing work in relation to the 59 measures for the national and local levels, and to examine also which measures, or often was proved to often be the case, aspects of specific measures should be developed to strengthen Sweden's ability to meet these global targets. The study also reflects upon the relationship between DRR, climate change adaptation, and the Agenda 2030. So the method was very much set out and organized all for me by MSB. So the gap analysis primarily reviews existing laws, as well as policies and guidance published by various government authorities. In addition, I conducted semi-structured interviews with representatives for different national and local authorities in the autumn of 2020, of course, using video conference software for obvious reasons. The interviews followed a list provided by MSB to me. It should be noted that the study is limited to governmental actors, does not include any interviews with representatives from civil society, NGOs, private sector, or researchers. There's also a limitation of this analysis that it was conducted over 6 months, but only allocated time for it about 7 weeks. So it's a little bit of a brief gap analysis, but it's been quite a very interesting one nonetheless. So to the key findings. Essentially, there you have the Swedish version of the Sendai framework as well. What I found, first of all, was that there's been really significant progress made, particularly over the recent years, which is significantly enhancing Sweden's DRR efforts. It's a very clear positive trajectory. However, there are very significant challenges persisting, which negatively is affecting Sweden's performance in relation to the majority, actually, of the 59 measures. I was assessing the measures at 3 levels. So level 1 would mean that the work is ongoing, it's beneficial, there is limited or no further action needed. Level 2 means that it's partially fulfilled, but more work is necessary. And level 3, meaning that it's not fulfilled and significant action is needed. A very, very high number. I think we ended up at 40, ended up at level 2, with only 9 at level 1 and 10 at level 3. And one interesting noteworthy outcome from doing the gap analysis through the focus of these 59 specific measures was that it clearly illustrates the importance of addressing these overarching structural and organizational issues in order for ongoing work to lead to effective disaster risk reduction and management. So under very many of the measures assessed at level 2, there is amazing, highly relevant ongoing work, but these overarching structural challenges limit the positive effects, essentially, of the work that is being conducted. So the key areas for improvement that we found was first of all, a more comprehensive understanding of risk. Those of you familiar with Sendai will know this as priority 1. And this is certainly an area where there is a lot of ongoing work being done, but there is still a lot of fragmentation and very much a lack of implementation of that ongoing research all the way into practice. So all authorities and municipalities are obligated to conduct regular risk and vulnerability analysis, and these are analysed and synthesized by MSB, and where relevant also the National Board of Health and Welfare. But still, within the Swedish system, as is I know common in other places as well, DRR is predominantly focused on sort of what they refer to as crisis preparedness, rather than this all-encompassing understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions as required by Sendai. There are examples of preventative measures, in particular relating to CBRNE or chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear and explosive hazards, and also increasingly climate change related hazards as well. Relation to climate change, we're seeing increasing considerations, particularly in relation to land use, building codes, but we're still quite far away from that multi-hazard approach adopted in the Sendai framework. It's important to note also, I wanted to note that there was one government department representative who works extensively on climate change adaptation, who stressed that there's a limited engagement in relation to prevention, particularly with climate change adaptation, in considering risks. If you compare that then to risks that have historically been more significant for Sweden, such as nuclear risks. So there is this sense of kind of looking backwards still and not really embracing the future challenges. There's further a need for increased oversight, clarity and coherence. This is a very significant problem. It's a commonly acknowledged problem in Sweden. I'm not the first one to highlight this by any means. This was very, very clear from the interviews, and it was pointed out repeatedly that there's a lack of a national picture or a common goal to strive towards. There's lack of follow-up mechanisms, and that all this highly relevant work and research and plans and guidances that are being produced are not quite generating the intended impact, and thereby, you know, those efforts are in a sense wasted, and we can do a lot more to harness the effects of those measures. And there's also a very clear want for clarity of roles and responsibilities. I'm not going to go into the details of that today because I promised Doug to keep to my 15 minutes. But if you can have a look, the report is freely available on Prevention Web, and I give some examples there as well. And this is an area where work needs to be done clearly. Relating to this clarity and support of different roles is increased funding for actors with significant responsibilities. This is stated clearly under paragraph 30A for those interested, under priority 3. This includes regions, municipalities, which need to be supported in order to be able to carry out their rather extensive duties that they have in the Swedish system. And it's very clear that a lack of resources is limiting the capacity of municipalities to comprehensively identify and address risks. And this is very important also in relation to the integration of climate change adaptation and DRR, which is arguably was clearly visible at the local level. And one really important thing that I learned was that even though there is quite a lot actually of funding available in Sweden, smaller municipalities are struggling to apply for this funding because it's related to specific projects. And in order to identify these projects, they need to have access to the data and access to resources to write these applications, which is not the case. And this is also coming back to what Tommaso was just talking about the need to have an open access data for climate risk and hazards. So one representative from a municipality in the north of Sweden within the Arctic Circle, highly affected by climate change, she put it quite frankly to me that even though they would love to do more work on DRR and climate change adaptation, if they are forced to choose between buying data for long-term flood prognosis or hire a teacher for their school, they are going to pick the teacher. And so it would be really beneficial for municipalities to have access to all relevant risk assessments and prognosis developed by other authorities without any costs, which is currently not the case. Finally, also inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized groups. Again, this is one area where both Tommaso and I are both very passionate about, which is why I love his project so much. But really important to include vulnerable and marginalized groups into DRR policies and decision-making processes. With regard to inclusion, Sweden generally performs well relating to gender, but there's little evidence of any other groups being represented or actively invited to participate in the design or implementation of DRR policies beyond the sort of standard referral rounds for proposed legislation. And I have suggested repeatedly, I suggest in the report and have suggested repeatedly since that this needs to be addressed in order to make sure that relevant knowledge and relevant perspectives are accounted for. And finally, I found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that there is a need for further integration of DRR and climate change adaptation work into the ongoing work on Agenda 2030. So, first I should say that Sweden does some fantastic work on climate change and on adaptation. Particularly would like to highlight the work of the Swedish Meteorological Hydrological Institute, SMHI. Simply amazing work in relation to climate change and also relating to warning systems. And they just developed a new warning system specifically then for weather-related events, but it's a new consequence-based warning system that is very promising in terms of the future and looking into risk information as well beyond climate. And there's a clear acknowledgement and agreement of the important role of disaster risk reduction and of climate change and climate change adaptation in achieving sustainable development. But there are still a lot of hurdles in place to incorporate this into practice. A lot of work needs to be done to integrate CCNDR into ongoing projects and to ongoing conversations relating to Agenda 2030 and sustainable development. Several representatives highlighted that although they are very aware of disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, Agenda 2030, there is a lack of a clear language around integration. They're lacking, there's no conversation about it directly, and they say they can't even have a conversation about it because they don't have the language necessary for having the conversation about the integration, which I found was really interesting. And something I think we as researchers should take quite seriously. But also, and this is of course tied to the former, is that aspects relating to these various aspects, so disaster risk reduction, climate change, adaptation, Agenda 2030, are often handled by completely different teams, even within agencies. And sometimes they work really well together, sometimes they have some cooperation groups, sometimes they are completely separate. There are signs of increasing integration, but this predominantly concerns climate change, adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and not so much Agenda 2030, which is dealt with quite separately. It should also be noted that, interestingly, local authorities and national agencies are under an obligation to conduct climate and vulnerability analysis that are completely separate from the risk and vulnerability analysis. Which further contributes to the separation between DRR and CCA, but it also creates some confusion as well as overlapping efforts. There are also some questions here, and I do mention this, I could not resist mentioning this in the report, that of course often we think of vulnerability as an aspect of risk, whereas here there is this idea that there's a separation. So you have climate, which is often considered then as climate hazards, risk and vulnerability as sort of separate things, rather than sort of updating that into the language that is being used, for example, in the Sendai framework. So also then the increasing focus, very, very strong focus in Sweden currently on improving crisis preparedness through civil defense mechanisms. So a lot of the language, a lot of the methods is very closely tied to the military and to civil defense. And this has absolute benefits. There's a really important progress being made in relation to preparedness, but it does risk inserting further hurdles into this integration between disaster risk reduction, climate change, and Agenda 2030. I think it's really important to bring together actors working on these different things to consider how best to streamline efforts and how best to integrate various reporting systems to avoid unnecessary overlaps of efforts and resources. And I'll almost stop there. So in summary, essentially what I suggest is that moving forward, there is a really clear need for a national vision, coherence and oversight. There is a need for further engagement with communities and with persons adversely affected by hazards. So I recommend that in developing this national action plan for disaster risk reduction, it's important that the process is inclusive and involves actors on all levels, as well as civil society, NGOs, private sector researchers, and to bring together leading actors working on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and Agenda 2030 to consider how best to streamline efforts. And to, of course, pay attention to the inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized persons to ensure diverse perspectives. And I will stop there. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marie, and also thank you for keeping to the 15 minutes just. So I think that many of the issues that Marie raises there are of relevance for other countries, and I think that's one of the issues which is so interesting about this topic, that the questions around the potential siloing of different groups, both at the national and domestic level, or the use of language, is it crisis preparedness, emergency management, disaster risk reduction. So I think many of these issues probably are cross-cutting in different settings. And so I'm delighted that we can introduce Catherine Mwangi to give an African and a Kenyan perspective on these issues. Catherine is a researcher in the International Centre for Humanitarian Affairs in Nairobi and is a long-standing volunteer with the Kenyan Red Cross Society with a specific interest in disaster risk reduction. In collaboration with Isabel and colleagues in the IFRC Disaster Law Programme in Geneva, Catherine is currently finalising a research report examining climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Kenya at the national and at the local levels. So thank you very much, Catherine, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doug. Interesting perspectives from Sweden there, and I can already see some shared challenges which I will be touching on in my presentation. Just to share my screen.
Certainly. So.
Please confirm you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. To present a study we did last year with my colleagues here at the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs. We were looking at the policy coherence, as Dr. Doug has mentioned, on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So just a brief overview of our study. Our aim was to contribute to the discourse on achieving a sustainable integration of CCA and DRR by exploring the role of law and policy making in Kenya and investigating community participation in the development of these laws and policies and its potential impact on community resilience. At a more practical level, this study will provide an evidence-based model for law and policy makers to advocate for effective normative frameworks that protect the most vulnerable against the impacts of climate-related hazards. So we did this study in Kenya in the 47 counties, which are the subnational levels of administration. And the methodology applied was desk-based analysis and empirical research. Through key informant interviews, we were speaking to national and county government officials, representatives from the civil society organizations, representatives from vulnerable groups in the communities, as well as academics with relative expertise. So we did a three-pronged inquiry on coherence in Kenya, looking at strategic coherence, institutional coherence, and coherence in resource allocation. Then we also had a particular focus on participation of vulnerable groups in CCA and DRR policy processes. I will adopt the same approach in presenting the findings, although I will speak in summary. So with regard to strategic coherence, we evaluated the goals and priorities of CCA and DRR in the national and county frameworks, to what extent they aligned and to what extent there exists a gap. So these are the key laws and policies and strategies that we analyzed, and details on their content and how they interlink can be found in our report. However, just to summarize, there exists some degree of coherence in terms of the normative alignment of the objectives of these frameworks. For instance, the Climate Change Act 2016 identifies specifically in its objects and purposes the need for coherence between CCA and DRR in Kenya. However, to note, we do not have a national law on disaster risk reduction yet, but the two overarching policies of climate change adaptation, that is and disaster risk reduction, the National DRM Policy 2017 and the National Climate Change Policy 2018, both aim to reduce the impacts of climate-related disasters and enhance resilience through mainstreaming CCA and DRR into development planning and the creation of relevant institutional frameworks. At the sub-national level, counties have also developed legal and policy frameworks. And from our data collection as of June 2020, about 10 counties had laws and policies on climate change adaptation, and 29 counties had some form of legal framework either in draft or passed. I must mention that this number has since gone up, with more counties legislating on this subject, especially on climate change adaptation. But the message here is that since the subnational frameworks are still nascent, there exists an opportunity for county governments and interested stakeholders to align and integrate the two agendas. Now, a number of gaps emerged from the analysis and KIIs with regards to strategic coherence. Number one, the fact that we do not have a national DRM law remains a hindrance on coherent implementation of CCA and DRR. This is mainly because the counties are reliant on national laws to act as a benchmark for the development of county government priorities and strategies. And then secondly, it also emerged that climate change is considered a cross-cutting issue in all that does not need a standalone legislation. And that has partly contributed to the significant number of counties that did not have a legislation on CCA to align to their DRR objectives. Thirdly, there is this misguided understanding that since CCA and DRR initiatives are drawn from separate laws and policies, then it follows that their implementation should also be done separately. And some national and county government officials noted that in the drafting of these laws, a similar siloed approach is followed, in the sense that only the expertise of DRM experts are sought when developing DRR laws, and only that of climate change experts in the case of climate change adaptation laws. And this in effect limits opportunities for cross-pollination of ideas. And the outcome is that approaches adopted are different, even though the long-term goal in the separate laws is the same. With regard to institutional coherence, the figure here represents the key institutions in implementing the commitments under the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Agenda, and the Sendai Framework in Kenya. Our report provides more details on the mandate and functions of each of these organs. But just to highlight that the National Climate Change Council here, established under the Climate Change Act 2016, is mandated to identify areas of coherence between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction at all levels of government. But just to highlight some of the issues that came up with regards to institutional coherence, again, the siloed approach continues to haunt us, just like in Sweden. Instances of institutional coherence are fewer as implementation tends to happen through the administrative and sectoral silos. And then financing is also a key challenge. In many instances, the institutions tasked to coordinate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction actions are not the ones responsible for the financing of these actions. And therefore, it creates some friction in terms of financing for the implementation of CCA and DRR initiatives. An example is the Climate Change Directorate, which manages the overall implementation of climate change actions, but it is the National Treasury that is responsible for climate financing. And the same is seen in DRR in the sense that the National Disaster Management Unit, the National Drought Management Unit, and the National Disaster Operations Center are the ones charged with the mandate of coordinating DRR actions, but the disaster risk reduction funding is managed by the National Treasury. A third obstacle is that the institutions created to implement climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction are created to undertake distinctive yet overlapping mandates with no clear coordination mechanisms. I have spoken about 3 key institutions which are mandated to coordinate disaster risk reduction activities, yet we do not have clear modalities on how the coordination should be done. Again, some of these institutions established in law and policies are yet to be constituted. For example, the National Climate Change Council I just talked about, which is expected to promote the coherence between the 2 agendas. Also, at the county level, responsibilities for climate change adaptation and DRR are distributed across different departments, and as a consequence, there's a tendency to view the 2 as separate sectors with their different strategies and priorities of work. To coherence in resource allocation and financial mechanisms for the 2 agendas, we made the following observations. Number 1, the fragmentation of climate change adaptation and DRR governance sectors is also present in their respective funding mechanisms, as they are often spread across varied ministries, across the 2 levels of government in Kenya. So whereas the Climate Change Fund and the DRM Fund have some strategic overlap, they remain separate funds created by different legal instruments and managed and implemented under different ministries with very little coherence in their implementation. Again, many counties are yet to allocate funds for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in their annual budgets, even in those counties with adopted laws and policies. And the lack of budgetary allocation was linked to arguably insufficient budgets to meet the county needs, and resultantly, priority was given to sectors such as health, education, and to recurrent expenditures within the county government. Again, there's this notion that since climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction issues are cross-cutting, then they are mainstreamed in all sectors and should therefore not have separate funding. With regard to community engagement, there are a number of challenges that impede the meaningful participation of vulnerable groups such as women, the elderly, the minority groups, and persons living with disability. And for one, in Kenya, the policy-making process is designed in such a manner that it inadvertently excludes those who are uneducated. So, for example, the laws are written in English with no provision for translation into local languages. The public participation forums are conducted in towns and in English without translators. And in effect, this inevitably leaves out the vulnerable groups who oftentimes remain uneducated. Then the technical language used in the text of policies, laws, and strategies on CCA and DRR is also geared towards the technical experts within the specialized fields of these agendas, and then leaving out all non-technical people from understanding the language and articulating their concerns. Then another challenge is that some county public participation exercises are done just as a formality to tick a box to meet the requirements of the Constitution. So in some instances, communities receive policy documents that are already finalized, and the adopted frameworks or the outcome of that process is not reflective of their views. And then further, many vulnerable communities do not understand the complexities within which policy actors operate in Kenya, and they lack the political influence and the resources to represent themselves. As a result, they remain vulnerable to other people's interpretation of what is best for them. There has, however, been some marked effort towards promoting inclusion through the adoption of participatory approaches to DRR and CCA, what is popularized in Kenya as the community-managed disaster risk reduction approach that puts the communities at the center of DRR planning and policy making. So for some counties such as Tana River, Kilifi, Garissa, they have been at the front line of setting up CMDRR committees, which draw their membership from representation of vulnerable communities, vulnerable groups within the communities. And then on another positive note, civil society actors have been working to support communities to enhance their capacity to influence policy processes. And then the country is also in the process of developing a public participation law, which, when adopted, will provide modalities to ensure that any group that is likely to be affected by a decision is effectively involved in the decision-making process. So that said, where do we go from here? Now, our report makes the following recommendations. Quite a number.
Catherine, can I just very briefly take my role as the chair? Just say, could you maybe wrap up within a minute, if that's okay?
Yes, I am
on time. Thank you very much.
Yes, so we made a number of recommendations, but the key is, number one, as a country, we need to develop a national law on DRR that is aligned to the national climate change agenda, to create overarching national institutions responsible for CCA and DRR, and then the National Treasury map out all DRR and CCA funds available to the state and channel them towards predetermined joint action plans, comprehensive risk profiles where, if possible, similar risk assessment tools are used across CCA and DRR, and then monitoring and evaluation on implementation of climate change adaptation and DRR activities should be done jointly across the two levels of government. On vulnerable groups, public participation forums should be done using multiple channels and languages to be more inclusive, simplify the language used in laws for the benefits of the communities they're geared to serve, and finally, concerted efforts should be made to include organizations such as the national societies that are in touch with the needs of the vulnerable groups. And with that, I say asante sana, which is Swahili for thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And there's a huge amount within your report. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think you bring up some very important issues around the institutional coherence and some of the challenges when you have lots of different actors at a governmental level and to local level. And also the resource allocations. Obviously, resources is fundamental for any of these activities. So highlighting the resource implications is very important. So thank you very much, Catherine. And for our final presentation, we're going to come back to Europe and to Ireland specifically for a presentation on research which has been conducted here in UCC by one of my colleagues, Peter Medway. So Peter is an independent consultant who has extensive experience in international evaluation and monitoring for international organizations. I mean, I can't describe all the countries and all the activities that Peter's been involved in, but he's worked in detail in Europe and Asia for UN OCHA, for UNICEF, for UNDP, and is also currently working for the Federation. And for the past 12 months, Peter has been working in the Marai Centre here in Cork, researching how to integrate or to enhance the integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction into Irish emergency planning systems. So Peter, thank you very much. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Yes, I've been working in the Marai Centre for the past 12 months, but I've never actually visited it or met anyone who's worked there other than yourself and Martin Letizier, the two co-principal investigators for this work. But good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. I'll jump straight into it. There we go. Just to let you know, Ireland, like every other country in the world, is exposed to extreme weather-related disasters, floods, droughts and storms, etc. Climate change is changing the frequency and intensity of these events. So far, the emergency response services, infrastructure and systems of government, like health and education, have been resilient and helped to contain the negative impacts of disasters in recent years. However, without adapting to the changing risk profile and ensuring public and private assets and services remain resilient to the changing risk profile in Ireland, the negative impact on us all will grow and potentially could be catastrophic. Our take-home message is that Ireland must continue to find more effective ways to ensure that its public and private systems, whether of infrastructure, commerce, social services, understand changing risk, avoid and reduce the level of new and existing risk, and that emergency services adapt their capacity, processes and posture to remain able to manage a growing level of residual risk. We offer recommendations on how this should be done as outputs of our research. We think the findings of the research, if implemented, will contribute to healthier and more sustainable communities. The research methodology was pretty straightforward. Our plan to engage key informants face-to-face to really understand the different approaches taken on the ground to integrate adaptation and risk management against different hazards was obviously disrupted by COVID, but it allowed for only an online interaction. You can see some of the evidence generated by the key informant interviews and and survey that we did in the slide there. From that, we were able to develop a research hypothesis that recognized the considerable work done in the area of integrating climate change adaptation and disaster risk management, not only at national and regional levels in Ireland, but also in Europe and globally. Our ambition was to build on what's already been done or put in motion to better understand risk and to integrate it into risk management and emergency response actions. We found Ireland has a substantial policy base, that mitigation work such as flood risk management led by the Office of Public Works and local authorities is extensive. We found that emergency response capacity has been equal to the level of risk so far, that climate-related information is increasingly available. And taken together, this is a strong foundation to integrate adaptation and risk management further. Ireland's policy and planning frameworks for emergency management are based on a sequential model of coordinated action throughout all the recognised phases of a disaster cycle, and this diagram will be familiar to probably all of you, perhaps in slightly different guises. Needless to say, in the real world, the connections and relationships between actors involved in different actions mentioned in this 5-stage model aren't as seamless as the diagram implies. In Ireland, the emergency planning system is primarily oriented towards preparing for and responding to emergencies of different kinds, and I'm sure that's the case in many, if not all, countries. Mitigation actions are planned and executed by different entities and are rather siloed. Again, probably something that's a widespread experience. Similarly, recovery and the concept of building back better are not well integrated into an overall strategic approach. While Ireland promotes the objectives of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in its overseas aid programming, it does not systematically strive to achieve these goals in domestic policy and practice. Indeed, Sendai is barely mentioned in Ireland's planning and policy for adaptation and emergency planning, even though it would be helpful in encouraging a more coherent approach to risk governance and other important actions. Drawing on European level research into the integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk model, we found that the SHIELD model that you can see in the diagram here, which was developed by the Espresso project, we found it to offer clear pathways to promote integration. These pathways highlight strategically important areas of activity around which integration can occur across themes of adaptation, of DRR, and of response, and the agencies that implement them. In reviewing the existing policy documentation and plans for adaptation and emergency planning or management, there were lots of things on the to-do list for lots of different organizations, but little practical guidance on the tasks needed to make systems work well together beyond their narrow thematic silos. And so here the activities that are highlighted in the SHIELD model around sharing knowledge, about developing and harmonizing capacity relative to risk, about institutionalizing coordination mechanisms, engaging stakeholders within and beyond government, leveraging investments to get the best out of every euro spent on adaptation or risk management, and developing communications to keep the public engaged are all critical pathways to better integration of DRR and CCA. We found that if institutions were to focus more on elaborating how they should work together, joining up effort throughout this 5-stage cycle through a focus on, as I just said, sharing knowledge, harmonizing capacity, and so on, according to the SHIELD model, it would make it a lot easier to collaborate in specific important areas that are essential to managing disaster risk. That is preventing the creation of new risk, reducing existing risk, and managing the residual or leftover risk that can't be mitigated out of existence. In this way, public and private systems are likely to become more resilient and less vulnerable. So in terms of our conclusions, we found that the 5-stage model for emergency planning in the major emergency management and strategic emergency management frameworks for Ireland implies seamless integration of the main stages. In reality, though, the integration of mitigation and recovery, the areas of greatest relevance when we're talking about integration of CCA, are not as well integrated into the emergency planning system as they could be. The focus of both those documents that I mentioned, the major emergency management and strategic emergency management frameworks, in practice are primarily on response. Secondly, applying the 3 objectives, as I call them, of disaster risk management, prevention of new risk, reduction of existing risk, and management of residual risk alongside the 5-stage model could facilitate clarity of role and purpose for lead government departments and their support organizations under the strategic emergency management framework in areas where integration with climate change adaptation is helpful. Thirdly, the main adaptation challenge for principal response agencies then is to ensure that their capacity is at least equal to the changing levels of climate change influenced hazards, community exposure, and vulnerability. Sectoral agencies and local authorities should integrate adaptation in multiple ways throughout their service provision and infrastructure, operations and management responsibilities. There are currently 2 discrete systems for the governance, management and coordination of CCA and DRR at the national level. Identifying ways to coordinate expectations for integration and to align incentives, priorities, and planning processes will facilitate further integration at all levels of government. Fifthly, sequencing policy making, planning, and research so that initiatives at different levels of government are coherent, mutually reinforcing, and consequently easier to implement and more impactful would be a good development. And finally, to achieve integration of all future policies and plans, they should be specific about the 6 pathways that we talked about earlier from the SHIELD model, specifically about sharing knowledge, information management, developing and harmonizing capacity, institutionalizing coordination mechanisms, engaging stakeholders within and beyond government, leveraging investments so that we get the best bang for the buck, and developing communications to keep the population engaged are critical. This will help clarify the who, what, when, and how questions that institutions are currently addressing iteratively, and in a way that is consistent with the existing model for disaster risk management in Ireland, as described in those 2 frameworks that I mentioned a couple of times, the Strategic Emergency Management and Major Emergency Management frameworks. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. And I think what was very interesting for me is the fact that we can draw on examples of good practice from other countries. So, for example, the Espresso project. I was actually just checking while you were talking. It looks like the Espresso project website maybe has been taken down from the EU because it concluded a couple of years ago, but we can maybe see if the link can be shared in future. But drawing on examples of good practice from other countries, I think that's where, when we see Sweden, Kenya, Ireland, there are many similarities between some of the issues that are being raised, despite the different contexts that we all face. So thank you very much to all 4 of our presenters. We have some great questions in the chat, and we have about 10-15 minutes or so when we can have some of these discussions. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to perhaps just jump straight in and pose some of the questions that we've received. And just to remind the audience, if you'd like to type in any questions that you have, please feel free to do that. So I'm actually going to start, Tommaso, with a question which was directed to yourself from Ricardo, asking, it says, thank you very much, Tommaso, for your interesting presentation. I'd like to know whether and to what extent you've dealt with a human rights perspective in your research project. In particular, what role can human rights law, and the activity of international human rights bodies serve in increasing coherence and alignment between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction?
Thanks, Doug, and thanks to Ricardo as well. And of course, a human rights perspective was one of the angles I adopted in my research, especially in the case of the Philippines, where the analysis includes a stronger focus on the protection of vulnerable groups. And the concept of vulnerability as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected is the theoretical linchpin in this sense, connecting the dots. And this is demonstrated by the increasing use made by this concept by both human rights and disaster law experts. So framing the protection of the most vulnerable through a rule of law perspective, I could see how the principles of humanity, dignity, and non-discrimination can be identified as basic tenets, and domestic laws and policies with relevance for climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and management should recognize, this is one of the recommendations, should recognize such specific needs and combine them with key human rights obligations like rights to food, to water, to sanitation, to housing, and humanitarian principles that are stated by international law. This approach is also stated by the International Law Commission draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters, which refers to the rights of particular vulnerable groups and their need for special protection and assistance. Just to give you a more specific example, the human rights perspective was extremely useful as in terms of how to include women and young girls in the list of vulnerable categories. This is quite discontinuous in international instruments of reference. This issue is occasionally framed as part of gender mainstreaming approach, and hence is addressed in a separate provision, separate from the one concerning vulnerable groups more explicitly, and this is the case for UN Agenda 2030 or the Paris Agreement in the preamble. While in other cases, it is recognized that women and young girls can be disproportionately affected by climate-related disasters, and this is the case of Sendai and the ILC draft articles, for instance. And in this sense, the general recommendation number 37 on gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change that was issued in 2018 by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was very useful, as it specified how the categorization, and I'm quoting here, the categorization of women and girls as passive vulnerable groups in need of protection from the impacts of disaster is a negative gender stereotype that fails to recognize the important contribution of women in the areas of disaster risk reduction, post-disaster management, and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So according to these different components and positions in my study, I consider gender sensitiveness and the explicit consideration of women in decision-making as a separate but interconnected requirement for the effective integration of climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction measures. So this is an example in terms of how human rights can really provide an additional tool of analysis, very, very useful as it was in this case.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tommaso. And as Tommaso said, in particular, the report you conducted on the Philippines looks into a lot of detail around the issues around vulnerability and what we mean by vulnerability. If I could perhaps also just flag the Yearbook of International Disaster Law, which some of you may be aware of. We have had recently had a couple of very interesting academic articles looking at different aspects of human rights and disasters. In particular, for example, looking at General Recommendation number 37 from CEDAW around the discrimination against women in disasters. So if people are interested, there's a range of resources available around human rights and disasters, which is, I think, of increasing importance. There's another question for you, Tommaso, from Carlo, but perhaps I want to come back to that after I've asked a question to Marie. Marie, there's a question here from DG Matthias, who once again says, a warm thanks for a very interesting presentation, Marie. Regarding the obligation of local authorities and national agencies to conduct climate vulnerability and risk vulnerability analyses, I was wondering how this obligation is assessed. Is it a binary matter of conducting an assessment, or are there qualitative requirements in those assessments? Are there any procedural requirements or guarantees? Where does the oversight occur? For example, for instance, by an ombudsperson. Is there scope for assessments to be judicially reviewed? Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. That is so spot on. The short lawyerly answer is it depends. No, thank you so much for that question. That is fantastic. So that is one of the major issues. So in terms of, it's not just a binary, there are some qualitative requirements. There are ordinances that are setting out, listing the specific aspects that need to be addressed. And those depend, they're different for municipalities and for other authorities and for regions. And then there are additional ones that are set out just in relation to sort of extraordinary events. So there are lots, and again, we're coming into the fragmentation issue here. There are lots of different types of risk and vulnerability analysis. What they have in common is that they have to be reported, they have to be written, there is very limited follow-up. And this is something that has been brought to my attention repeatedly by almost everyone I spoke to, because there is limited there is support for the municipalities if they wish to follow up, for example. They can be supported in doing so. There's very little power to make them. So this comes back to the very decentralized system of governance that Sweden has, and it's significant sovereignty for specific authorities, but specifically also for local authorities and municipalities. So that's quite, but it is a big problem. So I know a lot of frustration on behalf of those who maybe are responsible. So, for example, people working at MSD who are responsible for assessing these, they can recommend that they maybe act on these. They can recommend that they expand them, that they take them more seriously. They can't make anyone do anything. So no, there is no judicial review process, and this is something that definitely is under review and is being discussed. But it is a big shortcoming, I would say, of the program, because it happens, but it's not. And I think this is a common problem in many countries, not just Sweden. But it's an excellent question, and it's certainly something we as lawyers should think about a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I was going to actually pick up on that question around judicial review, because just to flag another resource which people might find incredibly helpful is the recently launched Disaster Law Database, which is a collaboration between Professor Bartolini's Roma Tre University EU John Monnet project and the Federation. And this covers the globe in terms of both domestic and regional instruments relating to disaster law, as well as a section on case law summaries. And so if people are interested in how the judicial aspects and the judicial understanding of risk assessments, vulnerability and responses to disasters, and in the broad sense climate change, this is going to be a section that's going to be expanded on the database in the coming time. So I'll just post information on that in the chat box. I'd also just like to ask if people have further questions. Can you think of that while I ask the question from Carlo to Tommaso? If you have any questions for Catherine or for Peter, we have another few minutes to go before the end of the session. So if people could perhaps think of questions that they'd like to ask. And Tommaso, I'm going to come back to Carlo's question to you now. And in fact, there's two questions here. First of all, is the legal one-size-fits-all model desirable under a pragmatic operational perspective? Do the country reports you took into account warrant this approach de jure contendo? And then secondly, can you expand on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the normative and legislative process which formed the object of your studies and reports? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks Doug, and thanks Carlo for these very interesting questions. And on the first point, I would say that one of the results of my research is that the full integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction agendas into a single body of laws or institution is not necessarily the best option, and different degrees of coherence should be envisaged in light of different country and local contexts. So the simple answer is no. Just to give you an additional element, what is particularly relevant is the size of the country, and therefore its institutional and legislative, and the sides of the institutional and legislative system. Like taking as an example, Dominica, 70,000 people, was much easier to develop and establish a unified, a single climate resilience execution agency, as it happened in 2019, and to task this unified body being a specialized execution body in charge of integrating climate resilience into Dominica's infrastructure development, capital projects, reconstruction activities. So all the different phases of the disaster management continuum are currently merged with socioeconomic development in all sectors, including in energy, food production, and transport, for instance. And this is a very nice, interesting example. But of course, this solution is not feasible in bigger and more complex national systems, like in the Philippines, which is huge compared to Dominica, the population of around 110 million. And in this case, for instance, there was the attempt, or still ongoing the attempt, to establish a single supranational agency, a new department on disaster resilience. And this brought several problems, and this process was hampered by the strong resistances by existing bodies, like, for instance, the meteorological governmental agencies, the scientific technical agencies working in the climate sector, the Climate Change Commission. All these bodies and the related staff, personnel, did not want to be included in a civil defense type of organization, didn't want to be merged in that kind of approach. So this is an example, a concrete example of why a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily a good solution or a viable path for finding a right solution. In terms of COVID, yes, of course, it had an impact on the research. First of all, because it blocked most of the ongoing legislative processes in surveyed countries, as of course governments prioritize the response to the pandemic, and this drawn on existing resources, both technical and financial. I must say, to be honest, that this is not necessarily a bad thing, as it took, considering that it took a minimum of 6 to 8 months to conduct the empirical research and write the report. At least I was sure that no big changes would have happened during that time, as this would imply the need to update and rewrite some parts of my final report or my studies. COVID, of course, impacted also on the methodological side, as I was meant to conduct in-person interviews, and this was not possible in all cases. But fortunately, there are specific training, including how to professionally conduct interviews through digital means. So this not hampered seriously the collection of data from key informants, and also reduce the carbon footprint of my research, which is important, equally important, I would say. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tommaso. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and so I'm going to let our colleague Professor Giulio Bartolini of Roma Tre University to say some concluding remarks. But maybe I'll just flag that there is a final question which we won't perhaps have a chance to answer, from Marlies Hesselman in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Marlies is also part of the Jean Monnet project, and so we're hoping that we will be having another event, whether it's a webinar or in person, organised by Marlies in Groningen. So perhaps her question around localization is something we can look at in the next event. But finally, just to hand over to Professor Giulio Bartolini. Giulio is a professor of international law at the Roma Tre University in Italy, and is also editor-in-chief of the Yearbook of International Disaster Law. He's the academic coordinator of the EU Jean Monnet project, disseminating disaster law in Europe, which has kindly provided funding for this webinar. So Giulio, if I can hand over to you for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks all the speakers for this very interesting event, also for the participants for having joined us regardless of webinar fatigue, which is now quite intensive, I would say. No, I was very impressed by the quality of the research which was made, which of course could only be done on a case studies approach in light of their in-depth analysis of different perspectives and challenges that we can find are different in different geographical areas in this regard, but which already share some commonalities, some elements of common concern which should be taken into account. At the same time, I think one further point of reflection to be left at the end of this webinar is that we saw, let me say, domestic efforts made in order to try to combine and to find an integration between the different international inputs. But at the same time, I think we should further reflect on how we could act, or what could be proposed at the international level to favor a more integrated approach, because currently the shoulder is on domestic actors and even more on subnational actors, which, as explained by Marie, by Christine, by the colleague from Kenya, on several occasions do not have the resources and the time and the opportunity to pay attention on such multiple international inputs, which arrive then with different deadlines, with different obligations and activities to be performed, which are very complex. So maybe what should be an element of interest, or maybe also even the speakers will reflect on it, is what could be proposed for at the international level, because we know that, of course, the potentiality to change the current instruments is very late in the period, but there are some periodic meetings like the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, of the meeting of state parties for the Paris Agreement and the other climate change treaties, which might eventually could be of an opportunity to favor a more stronger integration among the different communities and the different national inputs, because otherwise the risk for the national and subnational authorities to be involved in a endless race to follow such international inputs will be present there. So I'll just leave this comment for your further reflection, but probably that's an entity which could be taken into account for any further research based on the evidence and the empirical research carried out at domestic level, which already have shown up the challenges and difficulties to favor at the domestic level a more integrated approach. So probably more is in need for reversing the current system through acting not only at the domestic level, but also acting and asking for more coherence at the same international level in order to avoid such struggles for relevant stakeholders. And having said that, I also put in the chat a couple of references both to the disaster law database, which I think is a very helpful document resource, which could be helpful for everyone working on it, and also pay attention to the Jean Monnet project website for future events. We are planning to do a couple of further events in September, October, so just stay tuned and to follow potential further occasion of meeting and collaboration. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Giulio. And I think that's a very good thought for us to end on in terms of thinking about what some of the international approaches may be to try and promote coherence and alignment between the international, the regional and the domestic, as well as then thinking about how we have the integration at the domestic level. So I'd like to thank all our presenters very much for your contribution. I think the depth of your research really is amazing. It provides so much information and learning for us across countries and across regions. And the fact that this is part of a project which has further iterations in Groningen, in Rome, we certainly hope that the audience who've joined us will be able to be part of some of these future events as well. So thank you all once again very much for being presenters, participants, and as I mentioned, we will be providing a brief summary of this webinar, which will be available, and also there's a whole variety of links that have been posted in the chat, so hopefully you'll be able to follow up on some of this work yourself. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks for moderating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.